Human led an alien girl through the Ember Line. Her final gesture spoke more than victory. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jake Miller stood at the edge of the Ember Line, feeling the heat from the distant volcanoes, the air thick with the smell of ash and sulfur. The Ember Line was a treacherous stretch of land, filled with fire-breathing craters, blistering winds, and the constant threat of deadly creatures lurking in the shadows. It was not a place for the faint-hearted. As a former soldier, Jake was used to danger, but this was unlike anything he had ever faced before. He turned to glance at the young alien girl walking beside him, her purple skin glowing faintly under the harsh sunlight. Her name was Ashhon, and she had been separated from her people after a brutal raid by hostile forces. Her legs, once strong and agile, had been severely injured during the attack, leaving her vulnerable and in need of help. Jake had made a promise to her that he would get her through the Ember Line, no matter the cost. The path ahead was perilous, but Jake was determined to keep his word. They had already encountered several obstacles, raging fires, unstable terrain, and the constant danger of being caught by the enemy. But they had pushed through, relying on Jake's experience and Ash's intelligence. She wasn't just a survivor. She was resourceful, and her courage inspired him every step of the way. As they made their way across the scorched earth, Jake could see the exhaustion in Ash's eyes. She was clearly struggling, but she refused to show any weakness. She had come to trust him, and Jake wasn't about to let her down. The temperature rose as they neared the heart of the Ember Line, where the land was more volatile, the danger more intense. Jake knew they had to move quickly, but he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for Ash's safety. She had been through so much, and it was up to him to get her through this final stretch. As they neared the last stretch of their journey, Ashha stumbled, her weakened body unable to keep up with the pace. Jake reached out, steadying her. "We're almost there," he said softly, trying to reassure her. Ashha nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't want to admit how tired she was, but Jake could see it in her eyes. This was it. They had come so far, but now, they were facing their greatest challenge yet. The wind howled, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and the final stretch of the Ember Line seemed endless. But Jake wasn't about to give up. Not now, not when they were so close. Ashha looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and determination. She reached out, her hand touching his arm gently. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky but full of emotion. Jake's heart tightened. He didn't know if they would make it, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Her final gesture spoke more than any words ever could. It was a moment of connection, of understanding, of shared strength. Together, they had made it through the Ember Line, and no matter what happened next, they had already won something far greater than victory. The wind howled louder now, and the once distant sound of rumbling earth had become an oppressive presence. The Ember Line was a living thing, a scar across the planet, and as Jake Miller and Ashha pushed forward, the land beneath them seemed to groan in protest. Ashha had fallen behind once more, her limp more pronounced than before, but Jake would not leave her. His boots crunched over the hot, cracked earth as he turned back to offer her a steady hand. "You're not alone," he said softly, his voice carrying over the howling gusts. Ashha looked up at him, her violet eyes catching the light, filled with determination, though her body was screaming for rest. For a moment, she hesitated, then took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Together, they were stronger. "Just a little longer," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Jake didn't reply. Instead, he helped her to her feet, steadying her as they continued. The air felt heavier now, thick with the scent of sulfur and the ever-present sting of ash. It felt like the land itself was trying to push them back. Jake knew this was the most dangerous stretch, but the finish line was just beyond the ridge. As they moved forward, Jake found himself wondering how much longer they could keep up the pace. He had never seen Ashha so exhausted. Despite the relentless desert, the journey had forged a bond between them. She wasn't just an alien to him anymore. She was someone he cared about, someone he had sworn to protect. The moments they shared, the quiet exchanges when they rested, had allowed them to connect beyond the violence of their world. They weren't so different after all. Ash's strength and resilience were things he admired deeply, and as they reached the crest of the ridge, she looked up at the final stretch of their journey. She stopped for a moment, her eyes scanning the horizon. The Ember Line's heat shimmered in the distance, a mirage that seemed to twist the air. "We're almost there," Jake said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. Asha nodded, but there was a slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the strap on her gear. The last leg was never easy, especially in a place like this. Every step felt like it could be their last. Yet, as they moved forward, the weight of the journey seemed to lift slightly, as if the land was acknowledging their persistence. And then it happened. Asha's foot caught on a loose stone, and she stumbled. Jake reached out instinctively, catching her before she could fall. He steadied her once more, this time holding her a little longer than necessary. "I've got you," he said softly, the words more for himself than for her. "We'll make it through this." Asha's lips parted, as though she were going to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression both grateful and resolute. She might have been hurt, but she would not be defeated. Not while Jake was there. The wind howled again, as if in agreement, and for a moment, they both stood in the harsh light of the Ember Line, bound by their shared struggle. The rest of the journey stretched ahead of them, but they were no longer just two people trying to survive. They were partners, and nothing would break their resolve now. Together, they would conquer the Ember Line, and when they reached the end, it would be a victory that neither of them would ever forget. The sky above them had darkened as the day dragged on, the distant glow of the Ember Line now replaced by an ominous stillness that hung in the air. The volcanic peaks in the distance seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as if the land itself was watching them. Jake Miller felt the weight of their journey pressing down on him, but he kept his eyes forward, guiding Asha along the rough path. They were nearing the final stretch, a jagged cliff that led down to a valley where their salvation lay. Jake's boots crunched over the ash, his gaze scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of danger. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake, but Jake knew better than to trust it. Asha walked beside him, her every step slower than the one before, the strain of the journey evident in the slump of her shoulders. Her breathing had become labored, and Jake could see the pain in her expression as she fought to keep moving. He could feel her struggle, the way her body fought against her will to go on. But she wasn't complaining. Not a single word had passed her lips in hours. It was a silent, shared understanding between them. She would not stop until they reached the end, and Jake would not let her down. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice steady but laced with exhaustion. Asha gave him a small nod, though her gaze was distant, lost in the landscape that stretched endlessly ahead. She had been through so much, but this was their final hurdle. The Ember Line had tested them both in ways they never imagined. They had crossed rivers of fire, fought through violent storms, and survived an unforgiving terrain that seemed determined to break them. But now, with the valley in sight, the end was near. The two of them stood on the edge of the cliff, gazing down at the lush valley below. It looked like a paradise after the harshness of the Ember Line. Trees dotted the landscape, and the distant sound of running. Water promised life and relief. But Jake knew they weren't safe yet. The last step was the hardest. "You ready?" he asked, turning to Asha. She looked at him then, her violet eyes glimmering despite her exhaustion. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. Instead, she simply reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on his arm. It was a gesture of trust, of gratitude, and of the bond they had formed throughout this ordeal. "I'm ready," she finally whispered. Jake nodded and helped her take that first step. The descent was steep, and the loose gravel beneath their feet made every movement precarious. Asha stumbled, but Jake was there, catching her before she fell. "I've got you," he said again, his voice unwavering. With each step, they descended further into the valley, the weight of their journey lifting just a little more with each passing moment. The final stretch was grueling, but the promise of safety, of rest, was enough to keep them moving. As they reached the valley floor, Jake let out a sigh of relief. They had made it. And though the path behind them was fraught with hardship, it was the strength they had found in each other that had gotten them through. Asha looked up at the sky, her eyes softening as she took in the beauty of the valley. The harshness of the Ember Line felt like a distant memory now. Together, they had survived, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. They were free. The valley was everything they had dreamed of and more. As Jake Miller and Asha walked deeper into the lush landscape, the air became cooler, filled with the scent of wet earth and growing plants. The towering trees provided a canopy of shade, and the sound of a nearby river promised relief from the harsh desert they had just crossed. The weight of the Ember Line's trials seemed to dissipate with every step, but Jake knew that they were not out of danger yet. Their bodies were sore, their spirits weary, but they had made it. Asha moved beside him, her steps slow but determined, her eyes scanning the surroundings with an alertness that had not waned. The long journey had changed her. Once, she had been a quiet, reserved figure, burdened by the pain of her injury and the loss of her people. But now, there was a fire in her gaze, a sense of purpose that made her seem even more formidable. Jake had seen it grow over the past few days, her resilience, her strength, and it was something he admired deeply. As they approached the riverbank, Asha stopped, her eyes locking onto the water. "This is it, isn't it?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with wonder. Jake looked at her, not entirely sure what she meant. "It's a new beginning," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that clung to him. They both stood there for a moment, watching the river's current as it flowed endlessly, carrying with it the promise of life. It was a peaceful moment, one that Jake would never forget. For all the dangers they had faced, all the trials they had endured, they had made it here, together. The sound of rushing water was a reminder of how far they had come. Asha had come from a world of violence, a place where her people had been torn apart, left to survive in a broken system. But here, in this quiet valley, she was free. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. "I thought it would be harder," Asha said, her voice almost to herself. "The journey, I mean." Jake turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I thought it would break me," she said, looking down at her hands, "but it didn't. It made me stronger." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that Jake understood. He had felt the same way. The hardships they had faced, the trials they had endured, had forged something unbreakable between them. In that moment, Jake realized that this was more than just survival. It was about change. Both of them had changed. They were not the same people who had set foot on the Ember Line days ago. They had become something new, partners, survivors, and perhaps even something more. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the valley. The shadows lengthened, and the sounds of the world around them grew louder as the day turned to night. Asha looked at him then, her eyes full of a quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Jake smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "No thanks needed," he replied, his voice steady. "We did this together." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling in. The valley was peaceful, but Jake knew the challenges ahead were far from over. They had made it this far, but the future was uncertain. Still, as he stood beside Asha, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the horizon, he felt a sense of peace. They had survived the Ember Line, and together, they would face whatever came next. The night was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees as the breeze shifted. The valley had transformed into a peaceful haven since their arrival, a stark contrast to the desolate Ember Line they had crossed days ago. Jake Miller sat by the edge of the river, his feet submerged in the cool water as he looked up at the sky. The stars shone brighter here, untouched by the smog and smoke of the harsh lands they had come from. The stillness of the night offered him a moment of peace, a rare feeling he had not experienced in a long time. He was used to the constant noise, the chaos, but now, in the solitude of the valley, everything felt different. It felt real. Asha had gone off to gather firewood, something that had become part of their routine since they arrived. She had a quiet strength, something unspoken but undeniably present. The weight of the journey still hung between them, but in the quiet moments, the tension seemed to dissolve, and they found solace in each other's company. Jake thought about how far they had come. They had started as strangers, forced together by circumstance, but now, it was different. They were partners. They had survived the Ember Line, and now they were here, in this small pocket of peace. He knew that the world outside the valley still held its dangers, but for now, they had earned this moment. Ashhon returned, carrying a bundle of dry twigs, her movements steady but fatigued. She had not complained once since their arrival, but Jake could see the toll the journey had taken on her. Her legs were still healing, and though she tried to hide it, Jake knew it wasn't easy. "Everything okay?" Ashhon asked, her voice soft as she crouched beside him, setting the twigs down next to the small fire they had built earlier. Jake nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." He paused for a moment before adding, "It's hard to believe we made it this far." Ashhon looked at him, her violet eyes reflecting the light of the fire. "We're still here," she said simply. There was something in her tone, a quiet resilience that made Jake smile. "We are," he agreed. They both sat in silence for a while, watching the flames flicker and dance in the cool night air. The firelight cast soft shadows on their faces, and Jake couldn't help but think about how much had changed since they met. When he first encountered Ashhon, she had been a stranger, a wounded soul in need of help. But now, after everything they had been through, he couldn't imagine being anywhere without her by his side. It was strange how quickly things had shifted, how something so intense could build in such a short amount of time. "Do you think we'll ever get back to the way things were?" Ash's question cut through the quiet, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake thought about it for a moment. The question wasn't easy to answer. The world they had left behind was far from perfect, filled with war and destruction. But here, in the valley, it felt like a dream, a fleeting moment of peace they couldn't hold on to forever. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know we're here now. And that's enough." Ashhon nodded, her gaze fixed on the fire as the silence settled in once more. They both knew that the future was uncertain, but in this moment, surrounded by the calm of the valley, it didn't seem to matter. Together, they had made it through the worst. And for now, that was all that mattered. The days had begun to blend together in the quiet valley. Jake Miller and Ashhon had settled into a routine, one marked by small moments of peace. The river that had once been a symbol of their arrival now became a familiar part of their daily life. They spent their mornings exploring the surrounding area, learning the rhythms of the land, and their afternoons tending to the small camp they had made. The tension that had clung to them during their journey through the Ember Line seemed to lift with each passing day. But even in the tranquility of the valley, Jake could feel a sense of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. It was an instinct, the kind honed from years of survival. The world beyond the valley had not forgotten them. He had always known that peace, however fleeting, was a rare gift. It would not last forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with shades of orange and purple, Jake sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting. Ashhon was by the river, her silhouette barely visible against the fading light. She had been quieter than usual lately, and though she spoke little of it, Jake could sense something was on her mind. He had come to understand that, despite her strength, Ashhon was not invincible. The pain of her past still lingered, and even in the safety of their new life, there were moments when it resurfaced. Jake had seen the shadows in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He didn't know what haunted her, but he knew it was there, just beneath the surface. After a few moments, Ashhon returned to the fire, her face softened by the glow. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Jake glanced at her, his gaze lingering for a moment before he spoke. "You're quieter than usual," he said, his voice gentle. Ashhon met his eyes, her violet gaze thoughtful, as if weighing her words. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low. "About what?" Ashhon hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her water bottle. "About everything. About how we got here." Jake nodded, not pushing her. He knew that when she was ready to speak, she would. "Sometimes," she continued, "it feels like a dream. Like none of this is real. We survived, Jake. But at what cost?" Her words hung in the air, and Jake could feel the weight of them. He understood what she meant. The Ember Line, the hardships, the loss, everything had taken its toll. But they were here now. They had made it. "You don't have to carry the weight of it alone," Jake said, his voice steady. Ashhon looked at him, and for a moment, there was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes it's hard to let go." The past doesn't just vanish, no matter how far we run. Jake nodded again, understanding. It wasn't just the physical scars that stayed with people. It was the memories, the trauma that shaped them in ways nothing else could. We don't have to forget, Jake said, his tone soft but firm. But we can move forward. Together. Asha smiled faintly, a small, knowing smile. I'm glad you're here, she said quietly. I'm glad you didn't leave me behind. The fire crackled between them, the flames dancing as if to punctuate her words. Jake didn't need her to say more. He knew. They had been through too much to let go now. And even though the world beyond the valley remained uncertain, even though the past would never fully release its grip on them, they had each other. And for now, that was enough. As the night deepened and the stars began to twinkle above, they sat in silence, two people who had survived against all odds, each finding solace in the quiet company of the other. The days in the valley seemed to stretch on, calm and predictable, as Jake Miller and Asha settled into their new lives. The rhythm of the river, the whisper of the wind through the trees, and the quiet moments they shared had become a comforting backdrop to their existence. But as peaceful as the valley was, the weight of the outside world still lingered, pressing at the edges of their consciousness. Jake could feel it, like a shadow that never fully disappeared. He had always known that their time here could be temporary. The world beyond the valley was vast and unpredictable. Yet, for now, they were safe. Asha had become more at ease over time, though there were moments when Jake would catch a look in her eyes, a brief flash of the haunted past she carried with her. He had tried, as best he could, to be her anchor, to help her heal. But there were things only time could fix. He respected her silence, knowing she would speak when she was ready. One morning, as the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the valley, Jake was up early, making his usual rounds around the camp. He checked the fire pit, ensured the supplies were in order, and sat by the river to gather his thoughts. The cool air was a welcome change from the dry heat of the Ember Line, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake could breathe easily. He let the stillness of the morning fill him, trying to push aside the ever-present concern about what might come next. Asha joined him shortly after, carrying a small basket with the fruit and herbs they had gathered from the valley. Her movements were fluid, purposeful, as if the valley had truly begun to heal her. She sat beside him, setting the basket down, her gaze meeting his. I'm not sure how much longer we can stay here, she said quietly, breaking the silence. Jake turned to her, his brow furrowing slightly. What do you mean? This place, Asha continued, her voice steady but filled with a quiet uncertainty. It's a sanctuary, but it's also a reminder of what we've lost. I don't want to stay here forever. Jake understood. He had felt it too, the undercurrent of longing for something more, something beyond the safety of the valley. They had come here to survive, but survival alone wasn't enough. We can't stay hidden forever, Jake agreed, his voice thoughtful. But when the time is right, we'll make sure we're ready. For whatever comes next. Asha nodded, her expression softening as she looked out over the river. I never thought I'd find peace again, she said, almost to herself. But here, with you, it's different. Jake reached out, placing a hand on hers. We've been through hell, Asha, but we're not alone anymore. We don't have to face it alone. She looked up at him then, her violet eyes meeting his with a depth of gratitude he hadn't seen before. There was no more hesitation in her gaze, only trust. You've changed everything for me, Jake, she whispered. Jake didn't respond immediately, but in that moment, the weight of their journey seemed to shift. There was a new understanding between them, a shared resolve to face whatever the future held. The quiet moments, the simple acts of survival, had become something more. They weren't just two people living in isolation. They were building something together. And as they sat by the river, the promise of a future beyond the valley felt more real than ever. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves and carrying with it the distant sound of movement from the woods. Jake stood up, offering his hand to Asha. Let's go. There's still a lot we can do today. Asha took his hand, a small but knowing smile on her face. Lead the way, she said. And with that, they walked forward, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the valley as Jake Miller and Asha continued their daily routines. The valley had become their home, a place of refuge where they could begin to heal from the trials they had endured. But despite the peace, there was still an undeniable tension in the air, a sense of something yet unresolved. Jake had always known that they couldn't stay here forever, but he hadn't expected to feel the pull of the outside world so soon. They had lived in isolation for weeks now, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of nature and the quiet hum of their own thoughts. The world beyond the valley was distant, but it was still out there, waiting for them. Jake's mind wandered as he worked, clearing away brush and checking the traps they had set for food. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. Ashhon was different now, more settled, more at ease, but there was still a quiet storm inside her. She hadn't spoken much about it, but Jake could sense that the weight of her past still loomed large. It was hard for her to let go of the life she had left behind, the people she had lost. Jake knew that. He felt it too, but there was no going back. Their lives were different now. They had to be. Ashhon appeared beside him, her expression soft as she carried a small bundle of herbs they had harvested earlier. "How's it going?" she asked, her voice light, though Jake could hear the underlying tension. "It's going," Jake replied with a small smile, trying to ease the mood. "Just keeping busy." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on him, as if weighing something. "Jake," she began slowly, "have you thought about what comes next? After this, after we've settled here for a while?" Jake stopped what he was doing, turning to face her. The question had been hanging in the air for days now, unspoken but always there. He had thought about it, of course. He had always known that this moment would come. "I've thought about it," he said, his voice steady. "And I think it's time we move on. But we'll take it slow. We don't have to rush." Ash's eyes softened as she looked at him. "It's just hard, isn't it? To let go of everything." Jake nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The past had a way of staying with them, lingering like a shadow no matter how far they ran. But here, in this valley, they had built something. And maybe that was enough for now. "I know," Jake said, his voice quiet. "But we've got each other. And that's all that matters." Ashhon smiled, the weight of her unspoken thoughts lifting just a little. "I guess so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the valley surrounding them, distant birds calling, the soft rustle of the trees in the breeze. It was peaceful here, but the world was always changing. They couldn't stay in the valley forever. The future was out there, waiting for them. It was uncertain, but together, they could face whatever came next. "Whatever comes," Jake said softly, "we face it together." Ashhon nodded, her expression resolute. "Together," she agreed. And with that, the two of them turned back to their work, knowing that their journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, they were ready for whatever the world would bring their way. The days continued to pass slowly, and though the peace of the valley remained a constant, Jake Miller couldn't help but feel the weight of time pressing in on him. It was hard to ignore the reality that, eventually, their refuge would no longer be enough. They had been here long enough to know it was only a matter of time before they had to face the world outside again. Ashhon had grown stronger, but Jake could still see the flickers of doubt in her eyes, the remnants of the pain she carried from her past. They had come so far, together, and for a while, that was enough. But as the days wore on, Jake felt a restlessness stirring inside him. It wasn't just the need to move on. It was the knowledge that they still had unfinished business. The world beyond the valley had not forgotten them, and they couldn't run from it forever. It was a quiet morning when the change came. The sun had barely risen, and Jake was already outside, sharpening a blade by the river. The soft sound of the water flowing over the rocks filled the air, a reminder of the calm they had found. Ashhon appeared beside him, her presence as quiet and steady as always. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down next to him, her legs crossed beneath her. The silence stretched between them, comfortable, but Jake could feel her gaze on him. "Jake," Ashhon said softly, breaking the stillness. "What do you think will happen next?" Jake looked up at her, his hand still on the blade. He hadn't expected the question, but he knew it was coming. It had been hanging in the air for weeks, unspoken but always present. "I don't know," Jake said honestly, "but I think we both know that we can't stay here forever. There's more to do." Ashhon nodded, her expression thoughtful. She had always been more than just a survivor. She had a strength in her that had only grown since they had first met. But even she had to face the reality that peace was fleeting. "I don't want to run anymore," she said quietly. I want to move forward. I want to do something meaningful. Jake set the blade down beside him, looking at her. And you will, he said, his voice steady. We both will. But we do it together. Asha met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the trust that had grown between them. She didn't need to say anything more. The understanding was clear. Together, they would face whatever the world had waiting for them. The silence returned, but it was no longer filled with uncertainty. Instead, it was filled with resolve. They had made it this far, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. The world might be unpredictable, but with each other, they were ready for whatever came next. After a few moments, Asha stood up, brushing off the dirt from her clothes. Let's go, she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The world is waiting. Jake stood as well, offering her a hand. Lead the way, he said. And with that, they began walking toward the horizon, ready to take on whatever the next chapter of their journey would bring.